Hello, I've been dealing a lot with political philosophy as of late, but the first branch of philosophy that I fell in love with as a young boy was actually aesthetics. And now, especially in these pandemic times, I thought it would be nice to do a mini lecture on something a bit more positive. And so this will be a video on the perennial question, what is art? Now, I'm well aware that this question has been done to death by lots of people, but even though my answer to it might not be entirely original, I think we might still be able to reach some interesting conclusions along the way. So, here goes. I'd like to start by going back to the German philosopher Alexander Baumgarten, who is credited with having established the modern field of aesthetics. In his Metaphysics and Aesthetics, Baumgarten tried to establish certain rules for critical judgment of beauty. A few decades later, Kant, in his Critique of Pure Reason, Part 1, the Transcendental Aesthetics, says one of the few things across all his works with which I actually agree. In a footnote, he criticizes Baumgarten as follows. There is a mistaken hope on the part of the excellent analyst Baumgarten to bring the critical judgment of the beautiful within the ambit of rational principles and to raise these rules to the level of science. But this effort is in vain, because such rules or criteria are merely empirical and can therefore never serve as determining laws a priori by which our judgment of taste would have to be directed. Since so much of philosophy and aesthetics has been exactly this, an attempt to explain to others how they should view beauty, according to objective rules, in spite of this of course being so subjective, it follows that much of the philosophy of aesthetics can be discarded. Now, as a sort of reaction to this quote-unquote objective view, much later Marcel Duchamp famously believed that art is whatever the artist says it is. But this, in my opinion, doesn't actually go far enough, because if we say that art is whatever the artist says it is, then the question naturally arises, who is the artist? Which brings us back to square one. Duchamp's statement also seems to me to be an invitation to dilettantism, because then anyone can say that his ugly doodle or ridiculously bad poem is in the same category as Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel or Homer's Iliad. Some might reply to this that we could still distinguish between good and bad within art, but this then raises questions about these new definitions and just really pushes the problem one step further back without solving it. Now, this popular notion that art is whatever the artist deems it to be also carries with it the weakness of rendering more difficult the development of any unified movement of art, and thus of a culture of art. Creative endeavors thereby all too often lose sight of the positive and come to define themselves purely negatively. This is facilitated by the fact that once we try to define art, people inevitably attach adjectives and predicates to it. This leads me in turn to the Frankfurt School philosopher Herbert Marcuse, who in his 1955 book Eros and Civilization, in chapter 4, influentially celebrates the arts as a denunciation of social repression. But this gets it backwards. It is in fact the very decline of tradition and the decrease of social repression that make the arts assume such an antagonistic role today. We can compare that, for instance, with the situation of the very domesticated arts under the far more oppressive reign of Louis XIV, for example. That is to say that modern arts are not rebelliously heroic, but rather are precisely, because of the lack of repression, as frivolously antagonistic as they please. Now, that in itself is fine, of course, but it means that the modern arts today do not stand against the social order at all, contrary to what their creators would like to believe, but are instead a confirmation thereof. Modern art is what it is because society lets it and has stopped caring about it. This limiting of the arts that take place through such categorizations and descriptives as art, artist, rebellion, and so on, can be seen also in the contemporary politically correct harangue against so-called cultural appropriation. The truth is that great creative endeavors have always required cultural appropriation and a flow across borders, because the truly creative mindset scoffs at such limits and engages in an almost transcendent act of pure affirmation, where anything in the world can come to serve as source material. Funnily enough, the far left that preaches against cultural appropriation, thus in favor of closed borders, as it were, are very much in favor of open borders and against national identity in other areas. But precisely in the creative area, where the openness and the mixing of identities is so important, such people become closed and intransigent, and thus anti-artistic. So, in my view, what we have to do instead of all this is to discard the very category art itself and to reject it as a mere nominalistic exercise, meaning that as long as we have the physical particulars, it doesn't really matter what we call them. Nominalist categories are sometimes very useful. You can see, for example, in my video, What is Western Civilization and the Abuse of Nominalism? But the category art is not very useful, because it is precisely such a universal and all-encompassing category. When I was in junior high school, I used to fight with my friends about what art is, but by the time I reached high school, I realized that the question itself is pointless. By rejecting the question as pointless, we preserve subjective judgment, as Kant correctly says we must, but without specifically embracing anything and everything, as Duchamp does, at least implicitly. Now, some might say that my conclusion is really what Duchamp meant, but I'm inclined to disagree with that, because he often talks about art in such concrete terms that it seems to me to have thought that art really is something. So I find that the only question worth asking in this context is not what is art, but rather, do you like what you see here? Does it enrich you in some way? If yes, so much the better, and if no, then just move on to the next thing. That is, we discard, as far as is practically possible, the very nominal category of art. As I wrote a long time ago in my little book, Art and Aesthetics, the very question, what is art, is futile and sophomoric. Rather, does this work, whether you call it art or not, enrich you as an individual, or does it not? That is the only question, a more private question, worth posing in this regard. So, there you have it. I hope you got something out of this video, and thank you so much for watching.